have said up till now is that law relies on it having a scientific basis to gain validity. And what Davis has done up till now is said, well, you're relying on science as objective, but science itself may be less than objective. Two of your friends came up to me in the break and said, but are you denying that there are certain things that, like, there's no two ways of talking about it? So, like, if science is less than objective, then what about for example, the fact that I have 5 fingers? Can all of us agree that I have 5 fingers? All of us can agree. Where's the doubt? You can see them. But the point is, yeah, that is the point. So you're not interested in my 5 fingers because you like the numbers or something. You're interested in this fact for some reason. So just imagine, for the purposes of discussion, that I'm going to use the fact that you have 5 fingers as part of my definition. What does it mean to be a human being? Now suppose that I had an extra semi-finger growing here. Would you include me in your definition of human or not? Okay, so the point is that your definition is not the absolute truth. That is all that is being said, that do not have the confidence that I have reached the absolute truth of the matter. What does it mean to be human being? Because it is based upon observable facts. The fact that most human beings have 5 fingers does not authorize me to say that if you happen to have one less or one extra finger, you do not fall in the category of human being. So it's not only category, it is like so many consequences follow from whether you'll be classified as a human being or not. So this is the point that is being made by that, by relying on this notion that scientific method is something that gives us access to truth for guess, that scientific method itself helps us decide whether I'm going to look at 5 fingers as important, or I'm going to look at the possibility to reason as important in defining whether you are a full human being or not. That choice has to be made by me. But because I've made that choice but made it look like that it is scientific, then anyone else who doesn't fall in my definition then gets excluded, and that then could get denied their rights. So your point was that this is not the problem of science, this is the problem of what I do with the scientific information I have, right? Now, do you see the point, the difficulty? That science helps me decide whether you have 5 fingers or not. What I do with that information is not the domain of science, not the problem of science. Fair enough? Yes or no? I don't want you to go home thinking this was all right, but I didn't get the point. So, is that the problem of science, that I focused on 5 fingers as the empirical fact that I want to choose? What if I decided to use the test of whether you have 2 ears or not? Yeah? Can I do that easily? Like, whether it's fingers or ears doesn't really matter. The point is for me to be able to pin down some characteristic that will give me the confidence to say that all human beings have that characteristic. So we're not even talking about whether we'll give them any legal rights or not. Whether we will classify you as a human or animal has to be decided for scientific purposes. Okay, how do I do that? Look at your ears, look at your fingers, look at your toenails. Can do anything? That in itself, maybe I have the freedom to do. But what do I do with? So the point is, if you have 5 fingers, then you are classified as a human being. for science purposes only, not for legal purposes. If somebody doesn't have 5 fingers, what happens to them in your scientific world? You use the empirical fact of 5 fingers as giving you the final definition of what does it mean to be a human being. Okay, by definition then, you have excluded everyone who does not fulfill your requirements. What gave you the authority or the right to settle upon this test of humanity? To say that it is an observable empirical fact that all human beings have 5 fingers, and that gives me the confidence that to say that human beings equals somebody with 5 fingers. I can say that. That's not problematic. Is it problematic or not problematic? I can say that. That all human beings have 5 fingers. It is an observable fact, and therefore it is the truth of human biology that 5 fingers equals human being.
Having 5 fingers as a criteria for being a human being, again we are again there's a paradigm shift over here. Soon we might say having or not having hair or having hair is so basically there is nothing, there is what science does is gives us a fact. Whether or not to accept that fact and make it generally acceptable again is a subjective thing.
That's true, but what I'm trying to say is, what is the fact that all human beings have 5 fingers, or is it a fact that 5 fingers equals human beings? So the point being that I do not go around looking at people's fingers just as an abstract exercise. I want to use that information to come to some kind of a conclusion. Now, if I say that human beings equals 5 fingers, then my definition has excluded from the category of human anyone who does not fulfill my test. Now, is this objective? So, it's not only we make definitions, not only for legal purposes, but for scientific purposes also. So, what is being said here is, this is a kind of a very frivolous example, but when you look at it at more sophisticated level, what gets labeled as worthwhile scientific inquiry itself is a matter of how do you go about in a scientific in a science faculty to get funding for a certain research project or not. So I gave an example earlier that I and you want to do research on slightly different aspects of how do you define whether this is a I don't know. I can't think of an example, but we want to do research on 2 topics, and you happen to be the favorite of the dean, and you get funding, and you get to do your research, and you get to publish, and you become a known scientist. My research, I have to struggle with it. Nothing wrong with what I'm doing, but it goes nowhere. So the scientific truth, the scientific knowledge is then saying, this is a big discovery, and this is what it means to be a good scientist. Here is another discovery, but nobody knows about it, nobody wants to know about it. But the point of this is that some things get defined as worthwhile scientific inquiry, and something else gets defined as not so worthwhile scientific inquiry. And an example that I use in this context is that mainstream medicine, that is allopathic medicine, has certain ways of establishing whether a drug is useful or not, whether it is doing what it says or not. And they challenge the claim of, for example, homeopathy, saying that you guys are charlatans, you are making claims that cannot be proved. So what is the struggle between two schools of medicine is, one is the established way of doing things, the other is an alternative way of doing things. Now the established way of doing medicine is not only content to say that this is how we do it, they are saying everyone else should do it the same way. So their claim against homeopathy is that your claims are not true by our standard of truth. So they're not saying you show us that your system works. No, we are not interested whether it works or not. Show us that by our standard of proof you can reach the yes. Yeah, so the point being, why is it that only allopathic way of doing medicine is the right way of doing medicine, and their claim would be that is the scientific method of proof. Now, scientific method of proof does not mean that what somebody else is doing could be valid. What they are saying is, for you to be calling yourself valid, you will have to submit to our methods of proving. Why that is so? Because of all the things we said, that science is empirical, science is provable, science is using falsifiable theories, etc. And that's why we should be able to put our trust in that. So this is the point that is being made, that we are so used to the idea that what science does is actually the truth, and everyone else should then be able to do that. What Davis is doing for us is saying, hey, don't put your complete faith in the objectivity of science. What is the purpose of her doing that is that when you then go that law is a science, you are kind of using a less than perfect standard to claim validity, to claim respectability. So all this is basically for us to be able to now examine that when law uses science to validate itself, how does it go about it? Remembering always that the scientific standard itself is flawed, is less than perfect. So not that it is completely irrelevant or completely not true, but that it is not quite what it says. So just by giving something the label scientific, you do not make it good enough. So that is the point. So it's not saying that anything that science is doing is not right. No, just this, that only way of reaching the truth of the matter is the scientific method, and what she has tried to show you is that scientific method has many flaws in it. So if you find all this too difficult to take on board, my suggestion would be, and it is normal for you not to want to take it on board, because this is not how we've been brought up. So if some very different way of thinking is presented to you, you cannot take it on board like straight away. You have to think, you have to confront your doubts, you have to keep thinking about it, and that's what the point is about dominant ways of thinking. That we are so immersed in dominant ways of thinking that when something different is presented to us, we find it challenging, and that is normal. So it's not again a personal failing or something that I should be berating myself for. Rather, it is to acknowledge that we haven't been trained to think like that. The point being that we have been told that your training is the best that it could be. What Davis is saying is, it's good enough, but may not be the best. There is other ways of thinking, and why we need to think other ways is because the present system doesn't work for everyone. So the idea that we live in a rule of law society, and that means that it is a fair system, only works for some of us some of the time. For a lot of the people, legal system is a problem that they have to deal with. It is not about promises of justice or fairness, etc. What about their responses to law? If you're the guys who are going to be running the legal system in a few years from now, isn't it worthwhile that you at least start opening your mind to the possibility that not everyone's experience is as comfortable as mine, and the fact that I don't do anything about it then makes me complicitous in maintaining a system that is less than perfect. So take the claim of law that it is about justice seriously and start thinking about where is it that things could be different. The point about Davis is that he's saying difference has to happen at the level of how we think about law rather than about how to change section so and so of statute so and so. Because then the overall system remains the same and we just tinker on the outskirts and make small changes. All that is important. But Davis's point is that is not questioning the basic assumptions on which the system is premised.
So I interned in a police station for a month.
You interned.
In a police station just to see how actually police in UP or anywhere in India work. And believe me, when we shout a lot in the name of human rights and fundamental rights, but in actual or down there, it's very hard to deal with the problems which are there. It's not easy to ask even a simpler question if they are not breaking those laws or going beyond that what they are not supposed to. Even like asking a name is much more difficult for any police officer, be it of any rank. So having a realization of this particular thought which is coming from Davis, how far is it changing someone from there? Like,
all right, maybe it's not changing anything, but by not questioning, what are you changing? Nothing.
Nothing in sense, just like mechanically work is happening.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, so don't rock the boat, at least what is happening, let it happen. Is that what you're saying? Yeah? No, that's all right. I'm not putting on the spot, just trying to understand that that's what you're saying, that it is an imperfect system. If I try to shake things, it can have very dire consequences for very powerless people. Isn't it better that I keep quiet about it and let things happen as they are happening? I would suggest yes. But do I think that what is happening is okay? Do I think that it is all right? I do not, and you do not also. And what Davis is saying is, think of it at a deeper level than just that the police is the problem, the prison system is the problem, or something else is the problem. She's taking you to a more abstract level and saying how we think of law at any level is the issue. Now I made this point to some of you in the morning that we think of law most of the time as about rule of law, as about creating a society that is a functioning society, and the law in this system is something that is a desirable institution. But that is not the experience of everyone in society, that law is there to look after them, to create a fair society. To people who are in that police station, ask them, they will not think of the law as a fair system that is there to protect their rights. What happens to those marginalized people in our theories of law is basically, I was saying that there is another way of thinking about law, as that law is use of force by the state to oppress the people. Do you see that these are two opposite ways of thinking about law? Now, Marx's theory of law doesn't see law as a good. It sees it as a instrument of oppression used by the state to basically exploit its own population. Now, why is it not the dominant way of thinking about law? You can't say that one is correct and the other is incorrect. That option doesn't exist because we don't have a neutral standard of what is correct or incorrect. Then how is it that we don't, do you at all study Marxist views of law? Little bit? Somewhat? Huh? Everywhere? Okay. So why do you think that they are worth studying? Definitely. Then if you seriously thought that law was a means of oppression, what are you doing training to be lawyers? Do you see the point? That it is a theory that we can think about, we can dabble in. We are a progressive law school. We think of Marxist views of law all the time. But if it was really the case that you adopted that position, like convinced about that position, that law is a means of oppression, wouldn't there be an existential challenge happening to you that what am I doing training to be a tyrant? We don't do that. But on the other hand, we do think that we have the power to become lawyers and hopefully do some good. We may or may not succeed, but we identify with that understanding of law more than with that of the Marxist understanding of law. Now, is the one correct and the other incorrect? You can't say that. So the dominant way of thinking about law becomes dominant because we subscribe to it. We meaning enough of us subscribe to it. What Davis is getting at is that we subscribe to it because we have been sold this line that law is objective, that law is neutral, that law is unbiased. She is saying, how do you make all those claims? Is because you connect law to objectivity of science. So what she has done for us today is shaken our confidence a little bit that science may not be as objective as it claims to be. Plus, when we rely as lawyers on the objectivity of science to gain some kind of legitimacy for the law, we are using a flawed standard. Okay, so the second part of the argument here is, she's saying, let's see how does law use science. So I hope that I have showed you the reason why she is doing what she is doing, and it is up to us to now examine that idea again and again, and it may not be that you are convinced right from day one, but at least you have been exposed to the ideas and you decide whether it is worthwhile to run with them or not. But your reasons for deciding one way or the other would have to be explainable, would have to be convincing to somebody else. So it's not enough to say, I decide and I'm my own master. You are your own master, but you also have the necessity and the responsibility to communicate your ideas and convince others of how you think is actually a worthwhile way to think, even if you can't say it is the correct way to think. All right, so moving on then to Davis saying that how does law use science? Can I ask you to look on page 138 and tell me what is she getting at? Bottom paragraph, two paragraphs. So I'm asking you to read the subheading Law and Science. All right, tell me when you're done. You ready? All right, tell me what is she talking about. Have a go, it doesn't matter. Come on people, it's not so hard, yeah.
When we use science in legal context, what do we mean by that? As she says, we sometimes mean that we are referring to objectivity, neutrality, impartiality. Sometimes we are referring to a method. For example, issue, reasoning, analysis, conclusion. To a method of deduction. Sometimes we are referring to that. So there are various different meanings to using science in law. First point.
Yeah, very good. So basically what I'm getting at is that the argument is now becoming fairly specific, and she's saying as like without having to justify anything, we talk of law as science or legal science or something like that. What exactly does law mean when it says it's scientific? Could be that we are invoking the standards of science as we have been talking about, of like science is objective, so law is objective, so it must be like science, etc. So for getting validation for thinking about law, by thinking of it like we think of science. The second point is that we study law by using a scientific methodology. That is, just as you would use scientific methodology to deal with a scientific question, we can study law in a scientific manner. In that methodology that we are using is scientific methodology. Or we can use so-called established science and try to use that to study law. The example she is using is economics. So law and economics is a fairly established area of law. What do you mean by law and economics then becomes that you are first saying that economics is a scientific way of doing things, and how economics uses science to come to the conclusions as it does. We are going to understand law through that prism. So not through the prism of natural sciences, but economics as a science. So how would an economist talk about law? What would an economist do about certain issues that we consider so important in law? For example, in law, the most important thing we think of is that rights ought to be protected. When you look at law through an economic perspective, do you think an economist is really interested in your legal rights or your human rights? Or the economist could be interested in another aspect of you. Can you imagine an economist looking at labor laws? What would their angle could be? Would they be talking about workers' rights? Okay, so their emphasis is on cost and efficiency. They are saying that when you look at law as an economist or even as an economic phenomenon, the things that you need to talk about are cost and efficiency. Why are they not compelled to think about your human rights? They have declared them not as important as cost and efficiency. So it is a disciplinary emphasis which they are saying as economists, that's what we do. And for them for you to turn around and tell them, but no, human rights are important. They say, yes, that is true, but basically if your economic system is not working, what are you talking about?
I guess this is what we learned in law and economics, like it's their way of dealing with problems.
All right.
It's not eliminating or isolating with something which is which should be applied. It's just like this is the better way. And why they are saying this? Because it's cost effective, it will save time, and that's the basic idea of and with this I don't know why there's question coming, like why especially national law universities have this interdisciplinary kind of approach. Why too many streams are coming and engaging with law? It's just to again, like to certify or to make law more authoritative, or to facilitate.
All right. So if you don't study this here, if you don't study law and economics in national schools, will law and economics go away? It is happening. So one point I want to make is that this is now an accepted way of studying law. The more fundamental point that I want to make is, think about it very, very carefully for each one of you must find the answer is, imagine that the economic perspective of law became the dominant way of thinking about law. Okay, from tomorrow, your government is subscribing to ideas of that law is an economic phenomena, or economics is what helps you make sense of law. So whether a law will be passed, whether a law will be enforced or not, will be tested by reference to the principles of cost and efficiency. Can you imagine the kind of labor laws you would have under that kind of reasoning? Yes or no? Isn't that a valid perspective? What are you fibbing about? Do you see the point? Yeah.
Look at cost and efficiency. You would also look at not granting rights as a cost. You know, when you need to meet some goal. So in terms of efficiency also, when you want a law to be passed, you like let's take the principle of equality. So even from an economic perspective, you would want your society to be more efficient in that everybody is granted rights so that they can realize the potential, to the maximum. So I don't see why we have to only consider economics in terms of monetary, analysis, because even they try to look at the other costs, the real cost that one incurs when
Okay.
dealing with.
What constitutes cost itself is a debated concept within economics. I accept that. But the point that I'm trying to make is that if you take the perspective of economics, then economic concepts will take priority over rights concepts. So yes, we want to define cost and efficiency that can accommodate rights, etc., is a very different emphasis than saying the business of law is to uphold rights and cost and efficiency and other issues are secondary issues. Now, I think you want to say something.
Ma'am, you said that in economics we will concentrate more on cost and efficiency in a way which will curtail the human, which will encroach the human
Possible.
right, possibly. But in long run, it will harm the efficiency itself. For example, if you don't provide, so logically also, economics won't do that. For example, encroaching the rights of the workers itself, because in long run it will reduce the efficiency and the working capability of the worker. So
I accept that argument, but if you look at where the economic dogma has gone for the last 30, 40 years, it has seen the rise of neoclassical economics or neoliberal economics. What has been the trend across the world has been that it has taken away workers' rights in the name of economic efficiency. Across the world, I can bet my bottom dollar that you will not be able to show me an example where in the name of neoliberalism or neoclassical economics, the workers haven't suffered.
Why will they do it? Will they do it to respect human rights, or will they do it
Because
for
it's
efficiency? So they'll, what I can understand, they'll respect human rights so that it becomes, their process becomes more efficient.
Yeah, but for today's purposes, the example is only to show you that the use of economics as science has certain consequences when you start examining law through the economic categories and concepts. You necessarily have to then prioritize economic ideas, and yes, human rights will get, and that's kind of legitimizing the economic angle to say, don't worry, it's not going to take away your rights, etc. But it's not the intrinsic value of human being as a bearer of rights, that's their priority. All right, I'm not saying that you can't do that. What I'm saying is be alert to the uses of expert knowledge of another discipline to try to justify the kind of legal system that we want to strive for. 1 minute.
I just wanted to sort of bring in the distinction that we always make between an intrinsic way of looking at, human beings and an instrumental way. So you might find that law in economics from an instrumental standpoint may incorporate, a view of rights, but you may not find that, and if you don't have an intrinsic, like if you don't give intrinsic value to human beings, then there would always be some human beings would, from an instrumental purpose, who would be seen as redundant. So the law in economics argument cannot be possibly employed for arguing for the rights of those human beings. That would be my, on a very disciplinary basis, like maybe some people, like if I take a disability standpoint, maybe some people with disabilities, but if you are a person with disability who has no economic contribution whatsoever to make, but you might be, bringing joy and happiness by your being, the law in economics perspective cannot accommodate that standpoint.
That's true. Pushpa, you want to say something?
The potential danger that it will be in future to human rights. So that was the entire meaning, right?
Not that's just an example. That
Yeah.
one consequence could be that, and why that is a consequence that we should take seriously is what we are saying is that economics has given us the answers. Now use those perspectives to now see what kinds of laws should we be living by. So you kind of validated the economic perspective and said that now we are free to apply these to the law. Now the other point, I think I'm running out of time, but basically what Davis is getting at is she is saying we use law, we use science or science method. Are we okay? Yeah. Okay. So we use the scientific method in a very fundamental way in what are legal texts that we study. So do you use textbooks in your various areas of law, like criminal law, family law, and the rest of it? Okay. Have you ever stopped to think about it? What is the authority of the text writer? I mean, they're big names. I'm not suggesting that that's an issue. But why do we use textbooks rather than go to the primary sources of law, for example? So, first point, do you think that there are primary sources of law that you can access? What would that be? Yeah, textbooks are your authoritative. Yeah.
The whole point is not to create something, some idea, but to get away with the
Yeah, but
current situation or problem.
yeah, but I'm just asking you to kind of introspect that, ask for yourself, why am I being taught law through textbooks? They are concise, they give you authoritative knowledge, they save you time, they tell you what the main principles are, they are an efficient way of doing things, etc. All those reasons exist. But what Davis is saying to you is that think about it, that by creating textbooks, what is the message that is being sent to you is that to become good lawyers, all you need to do is read the cases. And which cases? Not all cases, important cases. Which cases are important cases? Are the ones that the experts in the area find out for you and put them in a book and present them to you. In the process, what is happening is that we are creating this idea that this is the body of criminal law, this is the body of contract law, this is what is important in any particular area of law. We are leaving out. First of all, we are relying on somebody else's reading of what is important. Secondly, we also know that most cases do not get reported. So what are the reported cases are a very small proportion of what is happening in the courts. Of that small portion, some of the cases have been identified by the experts and presented to you as this is adequate knowledge about an area of law. What has happened in the process is that a doctrine has been created as authoritative doctrine. So to be a competent criminal lawyer, I need to read this, not much else. To be a competent contract lawyer, I need to read this, not much else. Now there is a very good case that I might give the citation to you. It is mentioned in Davis's book, where critical legal scholars have basically gone through textbooks and showed you how the selection of cases is basically determined by the preferences of the authors. So torts cases, for example, tell you history of torts or the story of torts as about relationship between employer and employee, for example. But really the textbooks do not even get near the fact that how torts law operates is basically to the detriment of the injured worker rather than to the employer. So mainstream torts law tells you it is a good area of law where law is protecting the rights of workers and other citizens, etc. But that story is very different from somebody who's looking at the same thing from a critical perspective and saying there is no mention of that how compensation operates for life-threatening injuries, or what is the compensation that the courts are giving for somebody who is being injured because the employer was too miserly to put the adequate safeguards in place or to make a safe workplace, etc. So the point being that what is being presented to you as the doctrine in the area is a very skewed picture. Then you are told as law students that this is all that you need to know. You don't really need to know about the history of torts or politics of why something gets defined as crime and not something else, or the disparate power between the big companies, big employers and